You used to react to every slight, every insult, every misunderstanding. You raised your voice when disrespected, defended your worth when overlooked, explained yourself to people who never truly listened. But now, you've grown quiet. Not because you're weak, not because you've lost the fire, but because something deeper has shifted. You've come to understand a truth most people spend their lives avoiding. Reaction is not power, it's dependence. You see, the world feeds on your reactivity. Every time you respond to manipulation, you validate the manipulator. Every time you argue with someone who twists your words, you enter their chaos. They don't need to win the debate. They only need to keep you emotionally tethered. They only need your energy to stay relevant. And for a long time, they had it. They thrived on your confusion, your emotional spirals, your late-night overthinking. They called it passion, loyalty, depth. But it wasn't. It was entanglement. And slowly, piece by piece, you gave up your peace to hold on to people who never valued it. But something changed. Not in them, in you. You started to see how your reactions were costing you more than your silence ever could. You realized that the loudest power isn't in shouting back, it's in not needing to respond at all. It's in the quiet clarity of walking away without bitterness, of not needing to be right, of not needing to be seen. Now, when they provoke you, you stay calm. When they distort the truth, you let them. When they create drama, you don't audition for a role. And that silence, that stillness, it terrifies them. Because the moment you stop reacting is the moment they lose control. The performance ends when the audience stops clapping. And in your silence, they face a truth they can't manipulate. You've stepped out of the script. You're no longer playing the part they wrote for you. This is the quiet revolution of Stoicism. In this journey, we'll uncover what truly happens within you and around you when you stop reacting. Not to punish, not to win, but to reclaim what always belonged to you, your peace. You think you're in control when you react, that your anger asserts your boundaries, that your raised voice proves your worth, that your silence, when timed like a weapon, gives you the upper hand. But what if it's the opposite? What if reaction isn't a show of strength, but a sign that they still have access to your inner world? Because every time you flinch, defend, or even explain, you've already lost the most important ground, your center. The Stoics understood this long before psychology ever put a name to it. They knew that being provoked was not a threat, but a test. Not of what others do, but of how anchored you are in who you are. Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But most people live backwards. They give their mind to the outside world, letting every comment, every stare, every silence dictate how they feel. They believe power lies in having the last word, the perfect comeback, the sharpest look. But that's not strength. That's performance. Real strength is quiet. It's the man who listens and doesn't need to correct. It's the woman who walks away, not in silence that punishes, but silence that protects. It's the individual who doesn't need others to validate what they already know within. Because here's the paradox. The more reactive you are, the more control others have over you. You become their puppet, their echo, their mirror. They push, you pull. They insult, you defend. They vanish, you chase. All without realizing that your peace has become a currency traded on their terms. But when you stop reacting, the game ends. They can no longer predict your move because you've stopped playing their board. You no longer dance to the rhythm they set. You're not cold, you're clear. You're not passive, you're rooted. This shift doesn't come from arrogance or numbness. It comes from awareness. You begin to see how every reaction you gave was a seed you planted in someone else's soil. You watered their ego while starving your own boundaries. You gave attention to chaos and called it connection. And in trying to win their approval, you lost yourself. But not anymore. Now you pause. You breathe. You observe without attachment, listen without absorbing, and act only when aligned with your values, not your triggers. And to those who still rely on your reaction to feel powerful, this new you is a threat, because you no longer confirm their story. You no longer play the role they assigned. You've rewritten the script, not to be heard louder, but to need nothing at all. That is the illusion you've broken, the myth that reaction equals power. Because once you truly see it, once you stop giving away pieces of your mind just to feel seen, you begin to reclaim something greater than control. You reclaim your presence. Some people don't want connection. They want control. And your reactions are how they get it. They study your tone, memorize your tells, learn the rhythm of your emotions like a musician learning a song. Not to love you better, but to play you more precisely. Because to them, every reaction you give is feedback. A signal that says, I still care, I'm still here, you still matter. And as long as you react, they know they still exist in your world. You try to explain yourself calmly. They twist your words. You set a boundary. They push harder. You walk away. They pull you back in with guilt, silence, or sweet apologies rehearsed 100 times before. They don't always yell. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes they smile. And that's what makes it confusing. They'll say things like, why are you overreacting? I was just joking. Don't be so sensitive. You're the one creating drama. Slowly, your own instincts begin to erode. You start questioning yourself. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I misread them. Maybe I am the problem. But here's the truth the Stoics knew. A calm mind cannot be manipulated. The more centered you are, the less control anyone has over your state. And once you stop reacting, they lose the map. Their manipulation becomes a shot in the dark. They can provoke, but you don't flinch. They can disappear, but you don't chase. They can lie, but you don't explain. Not because you don't care about truth, but because you've come to understand that truth doesn't require defense, especially not to those who distort it for control. This new stillness you found, it doesn't scream, it doesn't fight, it simply exists. And that existence alone drives manipulators mad, because they can't grasp it. They can't use it. They can't twist it into something to dominate. They poke and prod, waiting for a reaction to confirm they still have power. But you remain still. You've replaced urgency with patience, reaction with observation, noise with clarity. And now, when someone attempts to stir chaos in you, you no longer see it as a challenge, but as a mirror of who they are, not a reflection of who you are. They expose themselves through their need to provoke, and you through your ability to remain unmoved. That is what Stoic calm does. It doesn't just quiet the world, it reveals it. When you stop reacting, you stop playing their game. And for the first time, you begin to see just how many people needed your chaos to avoid facing their own. There comes a moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, when something inside you just stops. You don't make a declaration. You don't stage a final confrontation. You simply stop reacting. At first, no one notices. They're still speaking the same way, pushing the same buttons, playing the same games. But then they realize nothing lands the way it used to. The trap doesn't snap. The hook doesn't catch. You're just calm. This moment is the shift, not an outward explosion, but an inward reorientation. A quiet turning away from noise, from ego, from the constant loop of reaction and regret. You're no longer pulled by impulse, no longer shaped by others' expectations or provocations. You found something sturdier within yourself, and it shows. The ones who relied on your reaction, they notice first. They test the old moves, sarcasm, guilt, silence, expecting the familiar flare-up. But you don't give it to them, not out of coldness, but clarity. You've stepped out of their emotional economy. You're no longer bartering your energy for fleeting validation. And it unnerves them, because you were once predictable, once pliable, once emotionally available at the snap of a finger. But now, your stillness feels unfamiliar, even threatening. And it's not just toxic people who feel it. Even well-meaning friends may interpret your peace as distance. They'll say, you've changed, because they miss the old you. The one who over-explained, over-apologized, over-cared. But what they're really missing is access. Access to parts of you that were never theirs to own. Because now your attention is intentional. Your emotions are not public property. Your presence is something earned, not assumed. And in that quiet shift, you begin to notice something too, a widening space inside yourself, a breath you didn't know you were holding, a stillness that isn't numbness but power. You begin to hear your own voice again, unfiltered by the noise of reaction. This is where Stoicism becomes real, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. Not in theory, but in the practice of restraint. The choice to respond only when response is needed, to let silence be your boundary, to walk away, not to punish, but to preserve your peace. They may call it indifference, they may call it arrogance. Let them, because they don't see the depth beneath your calm, the storms you endured to get here. They don't know the nights you lay awake, rehearsing all the things you could have said, and choosing in the end to say nothing at all. What they call distance is healing. What they call cold is wisdom. What they call silence is strength. And you, for perhaps the first time, are no longer a product of their perception. You're rooted now. And from this grounded place, you finally understand. Stillness isn't the absence of feeling. It's the refusal to be moved by anything that doesn't align with who you are. The world doesn't know what to do with a person who refuses to react. It's wired for noise, for hot takes, fast replies, instant outrage. Social media rewards speed, not thought. Arguments, not understanding. The world says if you don't respond, you're weak, you're guilty, you're losing. But the Stoic knows better. The Stoic knows that silence can be strategy, that presence doesn't always require a voice, that walking away isn't retreat, it's return. Return to the self, to clarity, to calm. When you stop reacting, you begin to see the world more clearly. The emotional fog lifts. You start to notice how many people live on borrowed energy, feeding on conflict, attention, drama. Not because they're evil, but because they've never learned how to be still. Your stillness unsettles them. Not because you're doing anything, but because they don't know how to exist without your reaction. You are their mirror, their sounding board, their audience. And now, you're just there, grounded, unshakable, present. And ironically, that presence, that unmovable stillness, becomes the most powerful force in the room. You speak less, but say more. You move less, but go further. You feel more, but carry it lightly. You realize that most battles don't need to be fought, they need to be left. That not every insult is an invitation. Not every invitation deserves your time. Not every time requires your energy. This doesn't mean you become detached from life. On the contrary, you become more alive. Because now you act with intention, not impulse. You engage with care, not compulsion. You feel deeply but wisely. And the ones who once drained you, they start to fall away. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it's just silence, a text left unread, a call you don't return. Not out of bitterness, but because the connection no longer reflects who you are. Your new quiet becomes a filter. The shallow connections fade. The loud personalities find someone else to provoke. The ones who only came for your reaction slowly disappear. And what remains? Peace. A rare, radiant stillness that doesn't shout. A life no longer shaped by the hands of others. A clarity that doesn't need to be explained to anyone. The Stoic path is not about suppressing your humanity. It's about mastering it, choosing response over reaction, stillness over chaos, truth over approval. And in that choice, something beautiful happens. You stop needing to prove yourself. You stop chasing understanding from those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop reacting to the noise around you and start listening to the quiet within, because that's where the real answers are. Not in what they say about you, but in what you choose to believe about yourself. Not all silence is strength. Some silence is numbness, suppression, a mask for unresolved pain. That's not what we're talking about here. The silence born from Stoicism isn't avoidance, it's alignment. It's not running away from emotion. It's choosing which emotions are worth your energy. And this distinction is everything, because it's easy to confuse stillness with shutdown, to assume that someone who doesn't react must be cold, disconnected, indifferent. But in truth, the opposite is often true. It takes a deeply engaged mind, a soul that has felt the full spectrum, to choose stillness consciously. You didn't become calm because you stopped feeling. You became calm because you finally felt enough. You let the anger burn through you, then you let it go. You tasted the bitterness of resentment, then spat it out. You lived through the storm and chose not to carry the thunder. And now, when others try to provoke a reaction, they find themselves facing a depth they can't reach, a stillness that can't be disturbed, a presence that says, I see what you're doing, and I choose peace instead. This doesn't mean you never speak up. It means that when you do, it's not to win, but to be real. Not to impress, but to express. Not to control the outcome, but to stay true to your values. Stoicism doesn't teach you to suppress emotion. It teaches you to master it, to feel fully, then respond wisely. It's not about being a statue. It's about being the mountain, unshaken, not because it never rains, but because it knows who it is beneath the storm. And the more you live in this quiet strength, the more you start to attract what aligns with it. Conversations that nourish, relationships that don't rely on performance, decisions that feel rooted, not rushed. You start to realize how much of your old life was noise, how many arguments were never about truth, but ego, how many replies were never for clarity, but control, how many emotional spirals began because someone else didn't know how to hold their own feelings, and you made the mistake of trying to hold them for them. Not anymore. Now you draw the line, not in anger, but in clarity, not to punish, but to protect. Your stillness is no longer a defense mechanism. It's a lifestyle, a boundary, a declaration that your peace is no longer up for negotiation. And people won't always understand that. They'll think you've become distant, that you've hardened, that you don't care anymore. But that's okay, because when you stop reacting, you start living. And you'll find that the more you align with your inner calm, the less you need from others, and the more you return to yourself. Quietly, powerfully, fully. You spent years trying to prove your worth, to be understood, to be seen in the right light, to explain your intentions, to fix the misunderstandings, soften the edges, and make sure no one thought you were the villain. It exhausted you, not because you weren't genuine, but because the people you were trying to reach had already decided who they wanted you to be. They didn't want your truth. They wanted your reaction. And for a long time, you gave it to them. Every correction, every emotional clarification, every carefully worded message, hoping this time they'd finally get it. But they never did. Not because your words were wrong, but because your silence would have taken away their control. This is where Stoicism enters, not as a theory, but as a turning point. You realize, I don't need to prove myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. You don't need to argue with someone who twists your every sentence. You don't need to perform emotional labor for people who see your boundaries as an offense. You don't need to defend your peace to those who find comfort only in chaos. So you stop, not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. This is choosing peace over proving a point. You choose your inner stillness over the fleeting satisfaction of being right. You choose silence that nourishes over noise that drains. You no longer need to be validated by those who once fed on your emotional availability. You become unreachable. Not because you've built walls, but because you've learned what not to open to. Your presence no longer lives in spaces that don't honor it. Your voice no longer echoes in places that distort it. Your time no longer stretches for those who only measure it by what they can take. And the world notices. They'll say, you've changed. You'll smile, because you have. You've changed from reactive to reflective, from chaotic to calm, from needing to be heard to being okay with being misunderstood. You realize your dignity was never in being loud. It was in being rooted. You've learned that peace doesn't come from proving your truth, but from living it. So now, when the moment arises when someone throws the bait, dares you to engage, tempts you into explaining yourself again, you breathe and you choose stillness. Not because you're weak, but because you know the cost of noise. You know the value of your energy. You've seen what happens when you spend it chasing clarity in people who benefit from your confusion. You've outgrown the game, and maybe they'll never understand. Maybe they'll tell a story where you're the villain. Maybe they'll say you gave up, but you didn't. You let go. And in doing so, you reclaimed everything they were never meant to hold: your peace, your presence, your power. That's not giving up. That's rising above. That's Stoicism. And in that quiet choice, that invisible internal victory, you become everything they never expected. Free.